What's up, gang? Welcome to the Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now, listen, the Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I say, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So, come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde. And boy, do we have a special guest. Jamie Wheal is in the house. What's up, Jamie?
Oh, doing well, man. Thanks for having me.
Oh, so good to have you here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, and then we're going to jump right in the show. I'm super pumped to have you here today to talk about all sorts of things. But before we get there, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. For audience members who are new to the show, Greatness Machine, we're about two things. People are living their passions, and those are creating greatness in the world and doing so despite the odds. And Jamie here is neither short of passion or greatness. So many cool things to talk about. I actually met Jamie at my Gathering of Titans conference at MIT a few years ago when he was promoting his book, Stealing Fire, with Steven Kotler, former guest on the show, and was just blown away. He rolled into the event with a Navy SEAL. They're promoting all this amazing stuff, the book, and I was just really enthralled by Jamie and his work. And fast forward to we launched the Greatness Machine. I was like, man, I really want Jamie to come on the show to talk about all the stuff he's working on, because the presentation that you did at MIT that weekend really blew my mind. And I was like, man, how do I get this guy on the show? So here we are today. So grateful to have you here. I always like to do a little bit of the formal bio. So I'm going to do that really quickly, and then we're going to jump right into the episode. So Jamie is the founder and executive director at the Flow Genome Project, author of Recapture the Rapture, his newest book that came out in 2021, as well as Stealing Fire, host of the Homegrown Humans podcast, and just all around human badass. So Jamie, welcome to the show, my man.
Thanks for having me, Darius. Psyched to jump in.
Yeah, pumped to have you here. So, here at the Greatness Machine, Jamie, we love origin stories. I love the context around people that are doing amazing stuff. Obviously, you're working on these amazing projects. I've written some pretty profound books that I've gotten a ton of attention. But I think for mortal humans are like, I don't know how to do that. And I always say, look, everyone's a human. It's about how do we apply our humanity to create the greatness. So I love origin stories because I really think that kind of gives people some background of like, hey, like that person started off kind of like I am, and this is their pathway. So I'd love a little bit of background, a little bit of your origin story on how'd you get to where you got to so far.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is beats the hell out of me. I just wake up a day at a time. I mean, even at cocktail parties, people are like, so what do you do? And I'm like, I'm not entirely sure. I write some, I talk some, and I love to go outside. So really, I would say probably one of the most formative experiences for me as far as like worldview shaping and kind of life path shaping was just that I was, I was an immigrant basically, and was kind of uprooted from a very, like BBC, All Creatures Great and Small, like bucolic English countryside, boarding school, Harry Pottery kind of childhood, yanked out of that and then dropped into America and had to make sense of it with parents who had utter disdain for all things colonial. My mother was South African, my father was English, and we were in the provinces, so like it was this bizarre experience of going to an American high school, going to college, all of these things, and sort of having no idea what the language and customs and norms of the natives were, and was always kind of this sort of outsider looking in at these curious behaviors, including, swinging from the rafters, Animal House parties and proms. And, even when I first got here, like, what the fuck is peanut butter and bubble gum? And how do you blow a bubble and pickles and Captain Crunch cereal? You're just like, Jesus, what is this stuff? Right. So those were all big deals for me. I'm still not signed off on any of them fully. So I think that, right, like that notion of being a stranger in a strange land led to a deep and abiding sort of curiosity on the anthropology of how we do this human thing. And then I was in my senior year of college, and I was getting ready to apply for grad schools, and I was thinking of like Yale and a handful of other programs in the Northeast that had really good history programs. And then I saw that old Robert Redford movie, Jeremiah Johnson, which was kind of like the Revenant with Leo DiCaprio before that, right? It was like him as a mountain man, and it was him in the mountains of Utah, and it was actually for Robert Redford, it was his inspiration. Like he fell in love with those mountains during the filming of that and founded the Sundance Institute, which is now the Sundance Film Festival, among other things. So like that was his big epiphany. And watching it, I'm like, son of a bitch, where are those mountains? In fact, there's this crazy old mountain man codger who's like dressed in coonskins and bearskins, and he's like the Andes is foothills and the Himalayas is for children to play in, but the Rocky Mountains, Jeremiah Johnson, that's God's country. And I was like, all right, so I withdrew all my other applications and I applied to the University of Washington and the University of Colorado. I was like, I got to get there,
Nice.
and that was really just the beginning of a path out into deeper adventure. I started kind of doing surf rescue on the East Coast on the Atlantic Ocean, but then went into ski patrol, went into outdoor guiding at the same time as pursuing this academic career. And I was studying basically kind of cultural anthropology and how did humans live in these mountains from prehistory all the way to tourism and, everything else in between, mining and all the bits and pieces, because that was the terrain that we were mountain biking, skiing, exploring, and adventuring. And I was like, man, I have to understand why that trail is here. Why is that mine shaft here? What's the impact and the relationship between human culture and ecology and sustainability and all this stuff? But I never wanted to do one thing or the other. I was never willing to be a dirtbag ski bum in a ski town. I was like, I love it, but I'm not going to deliver pizzas to do it. And I never wanted to just be a nerdy academic, because I remember my turning point on that was we were living way up in the mountains above Boulder. And I came back down for a class in like April or something. And one of my, colleagues looked at me with narrowed her eyes. She's like, why are your hands so tan? And it was because I'd been backcountry skiing without my gloves on. Right. And I was like, fucking hell. I don't know if like a career down in the basement of libraries assessing tax records is going to be for me. So really that just kind of led to teaching and guiding and in increasingly interesting environments, and just being forever curious about big, wild, open spaces and learning and life and leadership in those terrains where you can die, because that, really sharpens your focus. And at the same time, always sort of super curious about the life of the mind, the intellectual elements and the history and the culture behind those things. And that really just kind of led me to founding, the Flow Genome Project about a decade ago, which was, hey, how do I put all of these things back together in a way that is completely aligned with my passions and interests, and is maybe helpful to other leaders and to other people looking to level up their life and to find out what is their intrinsic motivation, or what is their sort of source of limitless drive and inspiration. Because I knew that, like living in Telluride, for instance, like I was like, if I could just get on my mountain bike and leave my driveway and be pedaling up dirt roads and fire roads and, to trails any day I wanted. And I did. And the same with backcountry skiing or anything else. And then when we moved to the East Coast, when our kids were little, I was like, I'm not putting my bike on the back of a bike rack to drive 30, 45 minutes to a trailhead to go and pedal. And nor am I going to go to a gym. And I was like, this is really interesting. I'm basically a lazy, unmotivated bastard inside, right? Inside all of the conventional realms. Like, do I go and do my workout? Do I punch out at CrossFit? Do I, whatever? But I have this infinite amount of motivation and inspiration to get to a summit before sunrise, or to beat my buddies down a trail or whatever it might be. And I was just like, that's really interesting. Because it was such a widespread, like to this day, I haven't gone and succeeded at a gym workout, but on the other hand, right, have taken people up to 23,000 feet in the Himalayas and, various other things that require some effort. And that was sort of my curiosity, was like, hey, peak experiences are sort of, these days, like everybody's curious about them, right? Whether it's meditation or it's psychedelics or it's sexuality or, or it's live music or whatever it would be. Everybody's curious about peak states, but the simple answer is we've kind of cracked that code, and we have for like the last 50 years. Like the hippies, the baby boomers had no shortage of peak states, right? But where they really fell down was long-term stable practice. So the founding of the Flow Genome Project was like, hey, now we have neuroscience, we have anthropology, we have optimal psychology. We kind of understand what's happening under the hood of all of these peak states well enough that we can kind of demystify them. And once you've done that, how do you then take that inspiration, that motivation that comes from those things, and apply it to long-term development and growth. And that's really the inquiry that I've been on my whole
I
career.
love it, man. I have so many questions for you. So I'm going to go all the way back to you immigrating here. And I come from an immigrant family as well. So it is interesting to see those dual cultures I'm an American. I was born in America, but my dad's Persian, and I watched him not want to acclimate right and to the environment. So how old were you when you came here?
I was 8.
Oh shoot. Okay. So you were like old enough to like be pretty entrenched in English culture, but young enough where you were a kid. And so were you, what part of the US did you guys move to? Did you come here too?
Near Annapolis in DC. So the kind of
Okay.
that's central mid-Atlantic.
And so when you first got here and, you know, having the kind of this, I don't know, it sounds like, was there a bit of a culture shock for you, or was it something where you're,
No, massive. I mean, my parents sent me to the nearest private school, which in bumfuck Egypt, southern Maryland, which is where there was the naval base, which is why we had come over. And it was just this literally like old school parochial Catholic school amidst the oyster fish, oystermen and crabbers and tobacco farms. I mean, it was ass backwards. And this Catholic school wasn't even like Irish or Italian. It was English Catholics from like 1634. Like it was that crew that was still in those rural counties. And so I went in there and it was like seeing First Communion, but I was I was sort of the goy, I was the non-Catholic. I didn't get to take communion in their worlds. I didn't, like, all of this stuff was just super bizarre. And my parents didn't give a shit. They were just like, go to school, come back and have good grades. Nothing less than excellence is expected. And even if you excel, it doesn't matter because this whole system is backwards ass and provincials. It was just, so by the time I got to high school, I just lied. I wasn't trying to like persuade my parents that it was really important for me to make it to, to go to the homecoming dance or to, do all these things. I'd just be like, see ya, I'm out, and just had led this schizophrenic parallel life, learning about American youth culture at the same time, but not even pretending that my parents would get it.
Did you, so having like, did your parents come from an academic background? Because it sounds like obviously academia was an option for you that seemed real. I find a lot of people that have that one of their parents or both their parents are academics. Is that part of your upbringing?
Yeah, I mean, interesting that my dad was like a sort of super genius polymath, and he was offered a full scholarship to Cambridge at the same time that he'd applied to flight school in the Royal Navy. And the flight school had an acceptance rate of like 2%. And Cambridge, I think at the time was, 6 or 7 or 8%. And since he got into the flight school, he went that route. But he ended up with the military equivalent of a PhD in aeronautical engineering and was a test pilot, a military test pilot. So, and dinner time conversations were Shakespeare and acrostic crosswords and puzzles and quotes from classical Greek and Latin, so it was a very kind of nerdy, heady kind of family culture as well, for sure. And then I just pictured, I was just like, I'm going to be a professor with elbow patches and a wood paneled office. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And I was all but done on a PhD. So all but dissertation. So I just had the final big paper to write, at the age of 22, because I'd gone to, in fact, I still had a fake ID in grad school. but so I was really kind of cranking along. And then there was just this one professional development seminar for grad students taught by an associate professor. And he's like, here's the deal. He goes, it's a fucking rat race out there. This is the beginning of like the temping of academia, where you don't just get tenure in a nice office for the rest of your life. And it was like, here's the deal. You need to do this, then you need to go postdoc, and then and they're going to need to apply. And then there's all the other postdocs who have actually done more shit than you, who haven't been hired for the last 2 to 3 years. And then when you get hired, you got your 5 years before you're up for tenure. And if you miss tenure, you're effectively put out to pasture for the rest of your career because you're now too expensive. And there's just as soon go back and hire one of those fresh postdocs. And I was like, oh, stone me, man. I thought I was 1 year away from my elbow patches, and you're telling me this is a knife fight. And that's when we went, and I was like, I think I'm going to take a break, and we're going to go and do more outdoor guiding, work at, nonprofit, learn, basically adventure and wilderness medicine and outdoor schools for a while, and then came back around to all this with the Flow Genome Project.
Interesting. So a question there. So it's really kind of interesting enough. Like when you described your dad, there did seem to be this like adventurous side to him if he chose to go to the Air Force or Royal. I'm probably misquoting what it's called.
Royal Navy. Yeah, he hated
The
the Air
Royal
Force.
Navy, excuse me. So was he in flight school? He was flying planes and jets and stuff, or what was his job there?
Oh yeah, no, he was the chief test pilot on the Harrier, which is that vertical takeoff and landing plane. That's how he came to the States in the first place, because the U.S. Marines also used the Harrier, and they were
Right.
killing themselves. They didn't know how to fly it, and so he was sent over by NATO to teach them, and then he was teaching at the U.S. Naval test pilot school. So for everyone that's familiar with Top Gun, right? Top Gun was actually below the test pilot school. So the very, very best of the pilots get into Top Gun. The very, very best of Top Gun get into the test pilot school. And the very, very best of them became NASA shuttle pilots. So my dad was basically training astronauts and
Wow.
was flying the baddest ass planes, the F-18s, the F-14s, all of these, the military grade fighter planes. And his job was to push them to the limits of failure and then map it with differential calculus and then teach the active duty fighter pilots how not to kill themselves.
Wow. I mean, like, was your dad academic? No, but he got into, he went and flew like the most gnarliest jets ever. And he was really smart. So it's interesting, right? Because when you start looking at the work you're doing around the, flow and the human genome and all this, it's like, I see a direct point of contact there with what your dad did. So do you think some of this is like nature, nurture? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's curious, right? So my dad became a sort of honorary member of the Naval Academy class of 60 something, because that's where all his friends were. So we used to go up to all the football games in Annapolis, and my parents were like, you're going to go to Annapolis one day. And I was like,
Oh,
well,
wow.
son of a bitch. Okay. So, I've really only got two options, right? I can only either be a test pilot. Anything less is a step down. Right. And so I have to be a fighter pilot, bare ass minimum. I couldn't fly, P3s or helicopters or something like that. Or I could be a SEAL. And those are the only two options that have enough cred to meet the family, meet the family bar. But I was too young. I was too young graduating high school. So actually, I was 16, right. So they wouldn't let me in. And they were like, you're going to have to do a year at like some prep academy. And I was like, well, fuck that. I'm not going to do the remedial thing that like dumb hockey players go to. I'm gonna keep going. And it was somewhat like conscious. I was like, all right, well, if I'm not going to go that military route that was kind of laid out for me, how else do I take life to the realm of real consequence? And so that's where surf rescue, wilderness medicine, patrolling, climbing, guiding came in. And plus like windsurfing and kite surfing. I was like, if I'm not going to fly above the clouds, I'm going to climb above them. If I'm not going to risk my life, in military combat or training, I'm going to put myself in lethal situations. And then just by the by, I also just kind of love coming to an understanding of something and then sharing it. And so the teaching, guiding, instructing, sort of just naturally continued, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense now. And I appreciate the backstory there. So, fast forward to, you're in grad school, you decide, you're kind of living this dual life of, to your point, like almost killing yourself in these like really cool ways and being one with nature. And then this other side where you're part of academia. And I get the reason of not wanting to, go put in the long-term effect of academia if basically you're being told that, this is not a great path. Right. On the other side of the fence, though, would you consider yourself like a thrill seeker? I think most people that are probably listening to this are like, and I'm just going to speak for myself. I grew up with people telling me what not to do so I wouldn't kill myself. So I was very risk averse around a lot of the stuff you're talking about. Whereas it sounded like you were all in on it. What was that the norm in your family where you're like, yeah, I'm going to go like swim in the ocean and do all this crazy stuff. And everyone's like, have fun. Like how did, like, is that again, like, I just want to frame that. Cause I think most people, I know I have a lot of friends who do backcountry skiing and they do big wave surfing, and they grew up doing it with their dads. And this was like a normal thing. And their family went on ski trips and they were always outside. Whereas my family, I'm half Persian. I always just joke that my dad's version of camping was going to Vegas. So like, it just wasn't a thing, right? For us, at least. So what do you think drew you to that connection? Was it just, again, a family thing, or was it innate for you? Like what got you to really ride on both sides of the plane there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, both my parents, my father was English, but they emigrated to South Africa after World War II. And my mother's family was South African. So they both grew up in Africa. And so everything from game drives and safaris to Cape Town and the coast and all these kind of things and, and boogie boarding and, around the shark nets and that kind of stuff was very much a part of their life. And then and they fell in love with skiing in Austria and Switzerland when we were in the UK, but I was not even born yet. And then when we came to America, and we were on the Chesapeake Bay, basically camping and fishing and water skiing became a huge part of our life. And then winters skiing, up and down the East Coast. And so that was the platform, where I was like, oh, those are things I love to do. Water skiing and slalom skiing led to windsurfing and other water-based high speed sports. Skiing in Vermont, and in Pennsylvania and New York became moving to the Rockies. So like it was very much a wonderful platform that they gave us and a love of being outside and doing stuff. And then just wanted to take all of those things as far as I could when I had the chance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any siblings or is it just you?
No, I was the baby. So I have a 5-year-old brother and an 8-year-old sister, and they stayed in boarding school in England. So like people always ask, well, if you were only 8 when you came, how do you still have even a shred of an accent? And it was like, well, it was because I ended up fearing the ridicule of my family more than I craved the acceptance of my peers. And, and we just, and it just kind of stuck. I lost most of it getting high in college. It's like the Beatles, like it's very hard. It's very hard to talk with a clipped Oxbridge accent when you're baked,
So, are your siblings, are they have the same affinity towards these higher adrenaline activities and outdoor stuff as you do, or is it more you?
Well, my sister was a journalist for National Geographic and the Cousteau Society, and she did one of those, article assignments of like, I'm going to go to ranger school in Africa and write about it. And then she fell in love with the head ranger, who then turned out to be the son of a woman that my mother had gone to boarding school with in Johannesburg. So that was it. So she's married and has very much an adventurous life in that way. And then my brother was a chartered accountant for KPMG in London. And my uncle was in the finance in the city, and he was going that route. And he came out to visit us in Colorado once I'd moved there for grad school. And we were skiing Winter Park one day on a beautiful spring day, smoking a joint on the chairlift, being like, and he's like, fucking hell, Jamie, I almost forgot this was out here. And he went back and he turned in his notice, much to my mother's chagrin. and he became a ski instructor in Vail and a blues guitarist. So yes, I completely sidetracked his world
I love
by
it,
accident, but yeah.
That's a great story. So once you got to this road where you're like, all right, man, I'm not doing academia. What kind of gives the path to the Human Genome Project? I mentioned before, I don't think I mentioned on the air that you and I have a overlap with the Stegan Institute, which is a conscious leadership program. I'm a Stegan grad, ILP grad, and actually teach their FLC program right now to a bunch of companies. So nice. I'm a big fan of Rand and his work, and love the Stegan family. But yeah, I'd love to hear like kind of what was the path that from there to okay, all right, well, what next? Obviously you have a pretty diverse background, right? But what got you to this point where you wanted to get to the Human Genome Project? Because I think that I really want to understand that. I know that there's been a lot of work and study, to your point, that people have looked under the hood and figured out like kind of how the biohacking works and how all the different hormones in the brain and how we can affect these. But we're now in a different realm, as you mentioned before. And I'd love to talk about that, but I'd love to hear your path on how you got to the Human the Genome Project, the Flow Genome Project, pardon me.
Yeah. I mean, really, it was a continuation of, I would say the singular thread through my kind of life and career is how do humans grow and develop? That's it. So the notion of flow states, my wife, Julie, is a Montessori director, so she was steeped in that form of education. I was I was deeply involved in experiential and outdoor guiding, as was she, but I was like kind of deep into like curriculum design and this kind of stuff. And it included flow states. It included what happens when people drop into the zone. What happens of maximum absorption and intrinsic self-motivation. And because, came across Carol Dweck's work, which everybody knows now as far as mindsets, fixed and growth mindsets, sure. a decade before she even wrote that book, because she was publishing papers that were showing up in the Montessori community. And I was like, oh, this woman's on fire. So there was all of that kind of background. And there was also all of the background in emergency medicine, wilderness emergency medicine, and alpine leadership. So decision making, group management, all of these kinds of things. And So I was just heads down on that for a decade plus, and was at a conference in Boulder, and one of Rand's colleagues saw me present on exactly this, on the genome of flow. And then I got a call from Rand, a few months later, like, hey, we do this really cool Stegan Leadership Institute, and you've got this really neat experience of leadership in critical situations. What do you say you come and be a part of it? And I was like, man, it sounds fantastic. You guys are taking leaders to the Esalen Institute. You're exposing them to, Zen teachers and practitioners. You've got Navy SEALs. You've got all these wonderful, really cool things. And you're dedicated, to doing conscious capitalism with John Mackey and others. Like you've got hearts in the right place and you're doing a kick-ass thing. And I was like, I love it. I love you guys. I'd love to do this, but I don't love Dallas. And I said, because, we'd lived in Boulder, we lived in Telluride, we lived in Santa Barbara, we lived in Hood River. We'd always been places that really made us come alive with beautiful nature. And we're like, hey, we keep hearing good things about Austin. I'll tell you what, how about I open an Austin office and I'll commute if I have to. And he was like, done deal. So that was how we ended up out here. And then we ended up effectively just raising our kids in Austin. It's been such an easy and fun place to live. And then, the last 3 years, everybody and their mothers also done the math and showed up.
Right. Yeah. You were early adopter. I'm like Dallas, Santa Barbara. I graduated from UC Santa Barbara. So I feel
nice.
you.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's kind of a tough trade, Speaking of Santa Barbara, I believe we have an overlap with Nathaniel Shocken. You guys, he's a friend, and I actually I met him at Esalen. But he's been a guest on the show. Great guy. So that's cool, man. He's a Santa Barbara guy. So cool. So you did the Stegan thing, and obviously Stegan's amazing, and Rand's an amazing guy. And what really transformed into the decision to move to the Flow Genome Project? And I want you to maybe talk a little bit about the Flow Genome Project. What is it? Who are you working with? I have a bunch of notes on it, but I'd love for you to tell the audience what it is. What are you guys doing there? How are people leveraging this project to, if someone who's attending it, who's becoming a part of it? Tell us a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm profoundly grateful for my time with Rand and Stegan, and I learned so much during that time. And back then, it wasn't just doing integral leadership program. There was also a consulting side, and I was predominantly like I definitely helped on the ILP and even helped co-create some of the learning to learn modules, right? Because that was a certain passion and interest. But I was spending most of my time actually inside organizations, right? And helping them work. And it got to the point where Rand and the other partners were like, hey, let's explore what a partner track looks like for you. And this would be the milestones and how it would go. And I just kind of thought, I was like, oh my gosh, this would be fun, meaningful, easy, and remunerative. It would work, as a career path. But I was like, if I find myself at the age of 50 hosting business lunches at the Austin Country Club to schmooze YPOers into an org redesign and a monthly retainer engagement, I'm going to stick a fucking fork in my eyeballs. And I will have absolutely forgotten what I'm here to do. And then fast forward to my deathbed, if I look back to my kids and gave them some half-assed excuse as to why I couldn't quite do the thing I was here to, I was like, I have to make this transition. And this was like 2009. So it wasn't exactly like awesome and optimal times for career changes, but I was sort of like, oh my God, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. And then, back to family of origin stuff, I was like, it was because it was terrifying to me. And I was like, oh my gosh, because growing up, perfection was expected. Right. Then I would never be able to achieve greatness, because perfection is the absence of mistakes, and greatness requires putting it all on fucking black. And the risk, I've heard a great thing, which is like, it's not art if there's not at least a 50% chance of spectacular failure. And I had to do some hard swallows and some really kind of, thank bless her heart. My wife never wavered once. She's like, we're going to figure it out, and whatever you need to do. But it was terrifying to me. And I also realized, like, the whole PhD thing, that was always one of my life bucket list checklists. I was like, why do I care about it? I care about it because I want to be able to write, teach, and have a platform of credibility. I could go back through that route, but really it is just a merit badge. What if I just went and did the things instead right away? And so those were all the hard swallows. and it's been a hard, deeply gratifying ditch digging project from then on out.
Yeah. Will you say a quote again? So if because I want to make sure I got that. You said if it's not 50, if there's not a 50% chance of, like, say that one more time.
Yeah, I think it was like something along the lines of, if there's not at least a 50% chance of spectacular failure, it's not art.
Oh my gosh, I love that quote. I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah.
That's cool. I wonder where that's from. So yeah, so you took the risk, right? Like you went and put yourself out there. And was it that when you think of this? I mean, I guess I call this is it like it's a leadership academy? It's a what would you
Yeah.
like for a layman who
Mhm.
wants to be told what this is? What would you say it is?
Yeah, super simply, we are a leadership and training organization, and it is a combination of peak performance, optimal psychology, and neuroanthropology. Right. So peak performance, fairly straightforward, right? How do we perform at our best
Right.
sustainably and over time? Optimal psych, what's the inner game of, right? Leadership and those things. And neuroanthropology, which is sort of an assessment of culture, doing two things. One is take anything that's going on right now and be like, okay, that's an event, that's an issue, whether that's, political culture wars or AI hysteria or whatever it might be. What's going on right now? And then understand where else in history have things like this shown up,
Mm,
right? Then understand what's the mechanisms of action underneath these things. So, for instance, Molly Crockett was at Oxford. She's now at Yale. And she's done fascinating studies on the neuroscience of crowd and mob and group dynamics. And she actually presented at Davos a few years ago on this. And she's like, hey, when people get stressed and they're in crowds, political rallies, this kind of stuff, right? Their serotonin, and they're isolated and alone, like in quarantine, those kind of things. Their serotonin plummets, all this, dopamine goes spiky, and oxytocin gets together when they get together in big groups. But oh, wouldn't you know it? Like, people think of oxytocin as the love drug or the cuddle hormone or the trust
sure.
molecule, whatever it is. It's also the ethnocentric curb stomp your neighbor hormone. You're right.
Oh, I
So,
didn't know that.
oh yeah. So when you
Really?
get juiced, it's why soccer hooligans are hooligans, right? And it's also
Wow.
right. It's why the mob mentality happens, because what happens is you get flooded with like tribal primate monkey shit. Like, we're together with our people, and
Mm,
your ability to other the other goes through the roof, right? And
wow.
Molly studied that stuff, and you're like, fascinating, and understanding why it was getting worse, why we had the Black Lives Matter rise. Not the only reason why, there's a million deep reasons, but one of the reasons why the isolation of quarantine then
Mm,
exacerbated our culture wars when we hit the streets, and it's Antifa versus Proud Boys and stuff like that, is like, that's a
right.
part of the reason why. And then she also
Interesting.
studied Burning Man, which is the opposite. It's an ecstatic celebratory gathering, but she studied
Right.
the neuroscience. So you're like, okay, this is not new. Humans have been doing some version of this dance forever, but now with contemporary science, we have insights into the mechanisms, and we've got a data set. We got more than one instance, and we can kind of learn a bit. And then once you know that, then you know how to architect culture going forward, because you understand how the building blocks snap together. So that's what we do. We basically train. We lead leaders, we teach teachers, and we heal healers. And we do that by providing the tools and the practices and the experiences, including adventure courses in the canyons. We go with a SEAL Team 6 commander into the canyons of Utah. We do alpine leadership in the winter in backcountry skiing situations. And we do, digital trainings as well, to give people the toolkits to lead, lives of impact and purpose.
What do you think? First of all, thank you for the explanation. And I know you guys did some really amazing trips, so that's super cool. And obviously, audience members that will be giving a connection on how people can learn more about this towards the end of the show. And we'll put it in the show notes. But I have a question for you. So yesterday I interviewed Lynn Twist. You familiar
Yeah.
with her or her
Yeah. Yeah.
work? Yeah. So she's on the show yesterday, and we started talking about source. And and so what did I think that one of the things Rand says that I'm sure you've heard him say, or maybe you even are part of him saying it, is that we have level 5 problems and level 3 leaders,
Mm.
right? And the world's full of level 5 problems right now. And so when I start looking at what level 5 leadership looks like, at least from my vantage point, being a trained conscious leader and just kind of hanging out with folks that I think are doing interesting things that are trying to solve some of these problems, one of the things that I've kind of fell into is this connection with something mystical, right? Something bigger than us as humans. And we were talking a little bit about this. I asked Lynn, she talks about source in her newest book, and I said, well, what is source? And what is your definition of source? And she talked it through, but I'd love to hear your thoughts when we start talking about like the culture wars and the problems, and you start looking back historically, and you're like, yeah, like none of this is new. This is like cyclical. I mean, in a lot of ways, right? But it's a new version of it, right? Humans have historically done really fucked up things to each other. And we've had these brief periods of, peace and tranquility. And we have the most complicated, from an information, people having access to information standpoint, it's probably the most complicated time in the world ever. And on the other side of this, when I hear you talk about nature and being in these canyons and being connected to the earth, I think source, like, oh, let's go connect with source. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on like, how does that play into performance? And at least from your vantage point, or if maybe I'm talking bullshit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. If A, do you think I'm talking bullshit? And B, if you don't, like, how do those connect if we were going to really level up as leaders and humans?
I mean, honestly, I would say anybody who's not at least pondering that at some level is remarkably uncurious. So, but as far as like what is source, with that, is it E prime? I think that's that name of that language form that tries to get rid of all conjugations of the verb is, because it just it creates false equivalency. So it's like you're never allowed to use am, is, are, was, or were, and you just have to state things in precise relationships versus false equivalency. So what is source beats the fuck out of me, but. Right. But I mean, I like fundamentally, I took a crack at that towards the end of Recapture the Rapture, the most recent book I wrote, which was, where does this information come from that seems to show up fairly persistently in peak states? And we kind of have the neurobiology of what conditions need to be present in a hominid with a prefrontal cortex and a spinal column and a nervous system to prompt those moments. But once you have them, where the hell is all of that information coming from? Right? Because it does feel epiphanic. It does feel, many people through history have assigned it to divine origin. It's the muses, it's God, it's guardian angels, it's ancestors, it's whatever it might be. It's not me. It's definitely not me, right? Some version of that. And I kind of walk through 4 somewhat plausible explanations, right? And the first one is reductionist materialist. But in those peak states, and this could include meditative states, contemplative states, psychedelic states, whatever's ramping up your perception factors, it's just more of what's already in you. So there's no external, mystical, quasi-mystical anything. It's just you perceiving more than you normally do. So it's not supernatural. It's just super natural. And that's sort of just expanded. It's basically the reducing valve of consciousness idea. So like Henri Bergson and then Aldous Huxley with his doors of perception said that most of us have a very tight little aperture. And then under peak states, your aperture opens up, and that feels miraculous. So you don't need to have any external explanations. No sort of Deus ex machina. No ghost in the machine. Nobody's doing anything. It's just you, more of you, right? That's level 1. Level 2 is something along the lines of epigenetic expression, right? The idea that, and it's a controversial, very young field still, but, you've probably heard on NPR or various bits that, like Scandinavian boys that went through a period of starvation during puberty in World War II turned out to be much healthier and have healthier offspring. So basically the idea of like going through forced intermittent fasting before your nuts dropped, right? Like massively improved the health outcomes of your grandsons. Bizarre, right? But then also crazy things like both descendants of Holocaust survivors having specific anxiety patterns. Right. Survivors of Civil War POW camps died sooner. So basically all these ideas of like, actually, it's almost like Lamarckianism, like, how Darwin was natural selection and Lamarck was basically the idea of like giraffes get long necks from stretching to reach the leaves. And that was ridiculed and dismissed, which was probably right. But it's almost like epigenetics is kind of like neo-Lamarckianism. The idea that behaviors and actions that we take within our lifetimes, not over generations of genetic selection, but within our lifetimes, informs what gets activated, which genes get turned on or off. And we can carry memories that are both physiological, like the Scandinavian grandsons having better cardiovascular health, right? But also psychological, like the downstream descendants of Civil War camps and death camps. right, in World War II. So you're like, oh, whoa. So that's interesting. Is it possible that somehow we gain access to more than is just within our own biographies by the epigenetic passing on of that information? So that's another level. You're like, it's still me, it's still us, it's still mechanical, materialistic, it's genetics, but it's just our updated understanding of genetics,
Sure.
right? And then you can go all the way to, do we have access to, this goes to like Wheeler, the physicist who was with Einstein and a bunch of others, but the idea that the fundamental nature of reality is information. So if you go with so basically it's all just zeros and ones. It's all just on or off, up or down, like even electrons, right? The whole thing of like the Nobel Prize this last year was on about like the non-local entanglement of electrons, up spin, down spin. That too is a binary. Everything, like the entire universe is just a 0 or a 1. If if you follow that thought experiment, and the idea that when we're in peak non-ordinary inspired states, however we get there, that we are just decoding more of that infinite information feed. So you can, and then you can take it all the way to, monistic or dualistic forms of consciousness. Monistic is going, well, actually, dualistic is there's a brain and the brain supports mind, right? That's the two things, right? And that's mostly contemporary. Most scientists would think that, right? But our buddy David Eagleman at Stanford, in his book Incognito, floated the concept, and this is, again, an existing one with lots of backstory on it, that brain or mind as receiver, right? Like our mind is like a radio, and then there's radio waves out there that we're tuning into. And that's more controversial. It has less consensus opinion within the scientific community, but it's also a fascinating prospect. And if you hear people like Joe Dispenza or other folks in that kind of non-academic neck of the woods still, barking up these trees, that's the kinds of things. People talk about spinal columns and pineal glands and, piezoelectric activity in the brain or whatever it would be, right? And you're like, oh, okay, so that's another untested hypothesis for now. But it does seem to me that my experience, just pure personal subjective content, is I have been routinely gobsmacked by insights and inspirations that have come, into my brain mind that really, really don't seem like they're just unintegrated bits of my own subconscious. They seem to be timely. They seem to be ruthless. They seem to be funny as fuck. They seem to, have a wicked ass sense of humor, and you're just like, was that me, like, done, pulling my own puppet strings? It seems, if so, that in itself is a whole other mystery of how we could be so wickedly smart and intelligent and hide that from ourselves.
Right.
But, but to me, it does seem like there is some element of non-ordinary transpersonal element to it. But like, with all of that said, the fuck if I know. And so I can have incontrovertible, subjective, personal experience of that. But that doesn't then lead me to leap across the line of like provisional skepticism and presume that the very next thing I imagine is actually true. So that's why, like hashtag, like, let the mystery stay the mystery. Like, right? Like sometimes it's just better to let the burning bush burn. And that is where, particularly in the realm of infomarketing, Instagram shamans, and ruthless, relentless self-help and hucksters, everybody is presuming to not just tell the mystery, but sell the mystery. Right. And that to me seems like a tragic oversight and overstep. Like all of humans forever have bowed down in the face of the vastness, right? And awesomeness and awfulness, right, of our utter insignificance in the big scheme. And that to me actually feels like an incredibly healthy position. Humility and awe and reverence and not knowing and being comfortable with the not knowing and proceeding anyway.
Yeah, I love it, man. And I love what you just said, because I have a really hard time believing that just because the aperture's opened up a little more, that suddenly this thing that I've been like really struggling with forever, I get the message that I've been waiting for that fixes everything at the right moment, at the right second, at the right time. And I'm like, oh yeah, that was just all inside me all along. It just happened to pick this exact moment that I really needed the fucking answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
And
I'll tell you one. Well, you go ahead and finish this thought, and then I'll wrap.
yeah, no. I mean, look, I've had experiences that are inexplainable, and yes, I'm sure by the odds, if every and any situation can happen just based off of pure chance, then you could argue that those things could have happened. But I'm like, there is no fucking way that happened at that moment in that way without there being some other intelligence at work that created that. Because because it involved other people. Like I've had these moments where we're doing like getting ready before a journey, and I mean, I can get into it it's a long story, and I don't want to burn up time on the show for it. But all I have to say is, I've had moments that are inexplainable that have led me to where you ended your statement of saying we are insignificant, and I feel very comfortable with that, and that there's bigger things at work that I don't want to try to explain. I'm just more curious than anything else, and I love your feedback. So anyway, I'll let you carry on, but I had to say that.
Yeah, I mean, it's that old Shakespeare quote. There are more things on heaven and earth, Horatio, than your philosophies. You're like, yep, I reckon so. And anybody who presumes to have plumbed the depths of the misto just hasn't gone deep enough. Like it's the sort of, there is no fervor like the newly converted. And so people who are just dabbling, it's sort of psychedelic novices and aficionados, like when I began my journey, and that they talk about 2014, you're like, shut the fuck up and take a seat. Like you have no idea what you're talking about. So there is that sense of like, you just don't know enough. It's there's old mountaineers and bold mountaineers and no old bold ones. You could say the same about psychonauts. That there's certain psychonauts and provisional psychonauts, and there's no fucking old certain psychonauts, because the mystery is limitless and vast and mediated through selfhood, genetics, the prison house of language, right, and cultural context. So we are not looking at the same thing every time people bungee jump into a peak state, and the only people that would presume any kind of false certainty just don't have enough data points on their map. But that said, we're gaining more data points. There's more people punching through. So like having a cartography of the sacred, or whatever, or the numinous, or the sublime, or the non-ordinary, even, like it does feel like we should be starting to cross map, and we should start to be getting a sense of what are the physics of the metaphysics. Like how do those non-ordinary states and spaces actually work? Is there alternate intelligence? Is there interactive, intersubjective intelligence? Is there multidimensional information layers? Like, I don't know, but we could be starting to cobble together. And there are people on the fringes of certain science that are starting to try and map that stuff. But like to your point about like, I've seen some things that don't make sense. I was just reading Sebastian Junger's recent account. He's that, war journalist, writer. He's done all sorts of, very well-known books. And he had a near-death experience this last year. Like literally had like an aneurysm or some weird thing in his driveway, like unexpected, bam. He was like early 50s, healthy guy. And he had a near-death experience where his dad, who's dead, was like, here I am, son, come with me. Let's go. And he's like, whoa, you're dead. No. And like literally it was almost like dad as tempter, which was kind of also bizarre for family dynamics, but nonetheless, like had to reject his dad's offer to come back to this plane. And he's like, I am a secular, rational atheist. This rocked my world and I still can't make sense of it. Right. And precisely because he's Sebastian Junger and he's a secular rationalist atheist, when I read that, I'm like, fucking hell. That's not like Touched by an Angel, like ABC after school special. That's not some evangelical preacher who's like, I've seen the kingdom of God and here's my best-selling book to tell you it's all going to be okay if you just donate to baby Jesus. He had no skin in the game. In fact, he was reverse incented, based on his worldview and concept of self, to actually have that experience. And he had it fucking anyway. Right. So to me, I bias that quite strongly. I'm like, okay, that's an interesting data point.
No, he had it inside him all along. The aperture opened up and then his dad totally like rocked his world. That's bullshit.
Yeah. He just got in touch with his inner Shirley MacLaine and it all just fell out. Right.
So circling back to, the work, like, so when folks come and they're like, hey, I want to level up. I want to kind of make sense. I have this curiosity of how do I have sustained peak performance? Cause I think like, I'll use myself as an example. That's what I want. I'm like, how do I show up and be the best version of myself every day? And how can I take the intelligence that's out there, the research that's out there, the folks that are really, for lack of better words, geeking out on this fucking shit, and then bring it to me in a way where I can then, hack, if you will, to the a better outcome without me having to figure it out for myself. Because I really feel like this type of work that you guys are doing is for folks like myself who are trying to level up and want to work with people that are on the cutting edge of this idea of leveraging flow and leveraging like all the access that you have to create for stronger sustainable outcomes.
Yeah. So, I mean, at least the cut at it that we've taken based on our best thoughts and experience is starting with foundation is basically individual peak performance. So how do I both, and this is, again, sort of back to memorable hashtags, just like hashtag do the obvious. There's nothing new under the sun. All the gadgets and gewgaws and pills and swabs and headsets and apps are all bullshit being sold to us by people looking to get inside our pants, aka our wallets, right? None of it matters outside of do the obvious, which is like sleep more, move often, eat real food, mostly plants, not too much, get outside, make love, be grateful, right? Digest, like weep, don't whimper, right? Like some very straightforward things. And we love to be distracted by bright and shiny objects.
Sure.
Right. Especially in America. I mean, America, like Tim Wu, who's the legal professor at Columbia, who coined the term internet neutrality. He's advised White Houses. He's one of my favorite contemporary thinkers and writers. He's almost always a decade ahead of whatever the hell's happening. And he wrote a book called The Attention Merchants. And it was basically the commodification of our attention, but also the conditioning of us into consumer zoo monkeys, like that we are, right? And it goes all the way back to like the late 19th century. Like literally the founders of modern marketing was an actual, like honest to God, former snake oil salesman, like the kind that used to do the little wagons going around the American West, like literally, and two bummed out like itinerant preachers. So you have this evangelical Christian like road to redemption, and you have the secret ingredient that's going to change your life, which is no different than right paracetam or quercetin or whatever the hell's the next flavor of the week inside your nootropic stacks. And you're like, sure. Oh shit, like that is literally it. We're trying to purchase redemption / eternal life. And so this wildly and uniquely American, redemptive, Pentecostal, evangelical, Protestant work ethic consumption machine, of which like Don Draper and Mad Men was like this little band in the middle, like transitioning to the 60s to the 70s.
Right.
That's us, and so to back all that stuff off and just be like, hey, get your house in order, have daily practices that allow you to prepare for and repair from the life you have to go live. Not as this will teach you to levitate. This will teach you to make 6 figures in your pajamas. This will give you the Airbnb, hashtag Lambo, life of your dreams, fuck wittery. This will simply just help you be resilient and responsive and responsible. So let's get that sorted, right? So that's everything from, how do you take an hour of your day? So 1/24th of a day and put it towards focus, recovery, nutrition, awareness, time management, that kind of stuff. How do you do that in a way that's quick enough and light enough that people will actually stick with it? Then how do you plan your weeks, your days, your weeks like a secular Sabbath? Like what's half a day a week that actually you dedicate to deep renewal, awe, and inspiration? What's a day a month? What's a weekend a quarter? And what's a week once a year? And build that, what we call a hedonic calendar. So like, how do you have increasingly deep and meaningful experiences that keep the momentum, that keeps the flywheel spinning on a high vibe life, basically, right? Me at full strength. Sure. And then get that sorted. And that's, that's usually our sort of introductory program and training. Cause if you don't have that, then everything else gets harder as you add layers to it. And then what we, program we call leading through fire, which is really just based on individual flow states or peak states are relatively straightforward, but figuring it out with a bunch of other tribal primates is so fucking hard. And it's the fail point. The fail point is almost always human culture, tribal dynamics, politics, egos, conflict, passive aggression, you name it, right? All the monkey stuff. And so taking tools, Bob Keegan at Harvard, many of the folks you're familiar with, Bill Urey, work with Carol Dweck, and Aaliyah Crum at Stanford, lots of other folks that we draw from, and just being like, here's the toolkit, where a little bit like Mr. Miyagi, like wax on, wax off, like here's the 6 or 7 tools that work for 80% of the stuff you're going to face. And if you learn these really, really well, you will get to step up. It does not mean it frees you from the human stuff. It just lets you not get sucked into the same ruts everybody else does. And that's, 6 tools that work for 80% of your troubles. And then what's the remaining 20%? That's gutsball, right? Like that's courage, that's wisdom, that's discernment, that's grit. Like can't teach that stuff. You can you can pick people up, you can encourage them, you can cheer them on, but like that stuff is you. And then we take it to the next level with like buds selection, in the Utah canyons with readers, with literature and poetry and Harvard psychographics and assessments being like, okay, now you actually want to go try this with live fire exercises. Let's up the ante for that. But really, I mean, all of this, and we just concluded a course, and I was just sharing this with folks at the end because I feel like I'm forever having to disabuse people of the seduction of the promise of the quick fix, and the promise that like, if you only learn this, back to Tim Wu and the crazy Christian substrate of marketing is if only you do this, then you will be redeemed and all of your problems will be solved. Right. And it's like, no, it actually, all these things do is get you to be a halfway functional human, right? At the doorstep of taking responsibility for these lives of ours. And there's that Zorba the Greek expression, where somebody's talking with him on the boat, and he's like, what's going on, Zorba? And he's like, oh, it's the full catastrophe, the house, the wife, the boat, like the things. It's the full fucking catastrophe. And to me, that feels so much more honest and valid. It's like no one gets out of here alive. We're going to bury our parents, right? Like 100% of marriages end in at least one person grieving. You're either burying your partner or you're divorcing them every single fucking time. And yet every single wedding is a celebration of hope. Like if we're lucky, we raise our kids so they walk out the front door and never look back. That's if we did it well, So like there's so much pathos and so much broken hearted openness about bearing witness to this human experience that to me is the role of peak states, right? They help remind us of what we might have forgotten, and they help provide the energy and inspiration to mend where we're broken so that we can get back in the saddle and go and do what's ours to do.
Man, mic drop. Nothing else to say there. I mean, I could pick your brain for 2 more hours, but we're out of time, and I want to respect your time. So I know you have the podcast, the books. Why don't we get to spend a couple minutes on the podcast, because podcast listeners, they know how I am about this. You have I'm one of 6 podcasts they're probably going to listen to, and might as well be yours as well. Tell them about the podcast, and then we can tell them where to connect with all the different stuff. But man, the Flow Genome Project sounds amazing, and I think our listeners need to go check it out. So yeah, tell them about the podcast though, really quickly.
Sure. I mean, basically the whole idea there was like, okay, so if you do all of these cool things, if you do all the personal optimization and you figure out how to lead and galvanize the people you love and or responsible for, what's the outcome? What's the end goal? And, in the spiritual traditions and even in the kind of new age pop psych traditions, it's sort of enlightenment, and we're like, nah, that doesn't seem to be very true or honest or helpful, for us these days. What's the goal? And to me, it's being a twice born human. Right, which is basically just a riff on the notion of like, hey, the first time we were born, none of us had much of a say in the matter. Mom and dad bumped uglies and swapped genetic material, and there was a little flash of green zinc as sperm met egg, and here we fucking are, and we get spat out of the womb, right, which was warm and cozy, into this cold, harsh, scary, unkind, weird world. And most of us are like, fuck this, I didn't want this. No, somebody did promise me a rose garden. I was back in it, vaguely Freudian, and so we seek to escape it or bypass it. And whether that's with sexuality or whether that's with substances or whether that's with doom scrolling on our Instagram or TikTok or what, or whatever it is, or over shopping or chasing brass rings and material consumption, we're all trying to escape this mortal condition. So when you have a death rebirth experience, which is these days quite programmable, there's literally like neurophysiological correlates, and you can tune them and Shazam, you'll have that experience. And you get to go, oh, just like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, like there's no place like home. Just like Jimmy Stewart, coming back from his suicide attempt in A Wonderful Life, like, oh my gosh, my life matters. Oh my gosh, it was slipping through my fingers. I didn't know how precious this was. That's the doorstep of becoming a twice born human, where we consciously offer consent to showing up fully in our life instead of, instead of being basically like a petulant child, pissed off or bummed that we didn't get what was ours the first time. So that's the whole premise of just like, we don't need fancy names. Let's just call it being a homegrown human. Like, I'm here, I'm now, I've put down my roots, and I'm making my stand, and I love the people I love, and I know what's mine to do. And here I am. So the podcast, Homegrown Humans, was really a chance for me to talk with and explore many of my heroes that kind of showed up in Recapture the Rapture. It was just basically that idea of, hey, I've written about you. You've inspired me. And this is everyone from Rick Doblin, the Harvard PhD, who's the founder of MAPS, the leading researchers on MDMA and clinical trials, to Wade Davis, the kind of original Indiana Jones, also Harvard anthropologist, Gabor Mate, Mark Hyman, all sorts of Amy Cuddy, Helen Fisher, the Kinsey Institute sexologist and anthropologist, all sorts of folks that have literally lit me up and expanded my frame. And I basically wanted to have conversations that were thoughtful and provisional. I'll tell you actually where it came from was watching Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson's conversation a few years ago, and they both just dug in. And like Jordan's holding out for like archetypes and mystical and meaning, and Sam was doing the clinical neuroscientist. There's nothing here, and they were just talking past each other, and it felt like actually their audience was more advanced than they were. It felt like there were people in the audience that were like, come on, guys, there's a both and here. Like, you can definitely create a synthesis out of these antitheses. Won't you just do it? And they both just dug in. And so the hope there was a conversation with people who have had enough transpersonal or non-ordinary experiences in their own lives that they can approach these thorny questions with some curiosity and some humility to get to the synthesis. And that's really the premise of the whole inquiry.
Oh, it's amazing. Wow. So much here. Jamie, you're a badass. I love it, man. I love all the stuff you're doing. I'm super interested in the Flow Genome Project. I'm going to check this out for myself, but audience members, go check it out. Flow Genome Project, the book, Recapture the Rapture. I'm super pumped to read that. Podcast, Homegrown Humans podcast. Where are all the connection points if people want to learn more? Give us our websites and Instagrams or wherever you're sending people to.
Sure. So the simplest is just flowgenomeproject.com. And then Flow Genome on Instagram. We're not on TikTok. Sorry, kids. And I think Facebook's a ghost town, so don't bother.
They're doing a lot now with viral, so they might be coming back. Oh man, Jamie, such an honor and so much gratitude to have you here to have this discussion and to learn more about the work that you're putting out in the world. And from the Greatness Machine, man, much appreciation for you.
For sure, Darius. Thanks for having me.
Oh, pleasure is mine. Listeners, listen, hey, leaders were givers. Share this with anyone who you think needs to hear it, and which in my opinion is everybody. So yeah, share the episode. And until next time, peace out. We love you. You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on, so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers, and after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.